I hope that today, what you learned today will be enough for you to get started on a customization at your own school. Okay, we're going to do an overview first of what workflow is, then I'll give an anatomy of the pieces of workflow, a bit at a high level. We're going to talk about roles and permissions. Workflow is, if you're familiar with our user group setup and the permissions assigned through user groups, workflow kind of takes that and spins it a little bit, and I'll show you how that works. Then I'll go through the advanced features and bells and whistles of the workflow customization options. You're going to see me build one from scratch, kind of pull it all together there. And then we'll talk about versioning a workflow, notifications, and a visual of what notifications actually look like. The workflows alert the participants in the workflow through an email alert, those notifications. And then we'll talk a little bit about some tips on how you would transition from your default workflow, current workflow, to a customization. So why did we, what does workflow do? Well, its purpose is to progress an object, whether it's a definition or a specification, from a drafting state through some kinds of editorial or standards review, different people working on it, on the object, or reviewing the object, to a final approved state. We made customization available in 2017. You can update your workflow at any time by versioning it. So if you have created it and then want to change it, you can do so and create a new version for yourself. This is a bit logistics for the talk today. There are two views of workflow, if you will. One view is, I call it the outward-facing view, which is for the roles, people who are creating definitions and approving them. And the other one is the internal-facing role, which is more of an administrator, the person who builds the workflow. We're going to see workflow from both sides today. A reminder that we're going to focus a lot on the definition workflow today. That's a lot of my demo is heavy on definitions, but the building blocks are the same regardless of the type of workflow that you build. We talked about email notifications. In order to build workflows, you need to have administrator permissions. So you need to be in that administrator user group in order to build workflows. I'm also going to give a few caveats today that I'm kind of assuming that the folks on the call have a pretty good basic understanding of their cookbook and how it works, what a user group is, what an administrator is. If you need me to explain something in detail, just go ahead and put it in chat and I'll get to it. But I am assuming that you are familiar with the cookbook and have used it and may perhaps be an administrator yourself. So there are 8 workflows in our Enterprise Edition. If you have the Knowledge Edition, you have the first 4. Enterprise Edition comes with 4 additional workflows. And as I said, the building blocks for workflows are all the same, whether you're approving a definition, approving a spec, approving a quality rule, it's all the same. You just mix and match those components to get those results. Of these 8, 6 of them results in what I call an object in an approved state. You're taking a definition, you're taking a quality rule, and you're taking it from I just drafted it to an approved state. The other 2 of the 8, number 4 and number 7, operate a little differently. Those operate like ticketing systems. So someone is asking a question, and when that question is resolved, that issue is resolved, the ticket is closed. So those 2 do work like ticketing systems, information requests, and a quality issue resolution. So they don't end in an approved state. They end in more of a closed ticket kind of a state. Okay. I want to show you, I sometimes call it how it looks out in the wild. This would be a public-facing, this is what the workflow looks like if you are someone who's interacting in the creation of it, in this case a definition. So I have navigated, I'm in my demo account, and I've navigated to a definition called academic division. I am logged in as an administrator, so I have permission to do all of these actions. If I was an editor or a data steward, some of my permissions would appear differently. This bar, hide workflow, show workflow, that is where the information about the workflow that is operating on this object, this definition, resides. So if I see a brief version of it here, if I show workflow, I can see the details. This is telling me my 3 stages: drafting, review, and approved. This is communicating to me that I'm in the first one, drafting. Over here, this is communicating to me what actions can I take. I can submit this item, I can also reject this item, or I can approve it. The steps that are available to me are here. I have 2 steps available to me. Again, I have very high permissions at this point. I can edit the draft as a regular editor, or I can edit the draft as a moderator. If I was going to, so when I've finished editing and I want to submit that, I click the submit button. I choose not to add a comment. And that transitions me into the review stage. You see the color there changed and the word changed. I went to another stage. And if I show workflow, you can see that now the review button is darkened, indicating that I'm traversing through this workflow. And I have one more step to get to, which is the approved state. From this point in the workflow, what's available to me is I can approve it. I can also send it back to drafting and ask the person the editor who worked on it in drafting, to ask them a question or ask for further information from them, or I can reject it. I'm going to go ahead and approve that. I'm going to choose again to not make a comment. And it's going to turn green and go into the approved state. And if I show workflow, notice there are no more transition actions over here because the workflow is closed. The object is in the approved state, and it's noted here as well. If I wanted to go to a new version of this, I would simply click New Version, and that would kick off the process again, starting at the drafting stage. So here I am at the initial stage. I would click Save, and that takes me to the drafting stage. One last feature that I'll show you at this point, we'll talk about it in detail later on in the session, is Collaborator. This is where I could bring in another colleague, let's say Don Nation. I could ask him to either comment, edit, or delegate my entire user role at this point to him. If I wanted him to edit, I can give him some instruction there and add him. He just now got an email notification, and he will come in and take that action that I've asked him to. So I can bring in designated people at specifically for certain definitions at certain times in the workflow. There's a flexibility there to bring folks in on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so from here I'm going to show you now the administrative side of how you build and create the features, the options that generate a workflow similar to this. So I want to go back to the slide deck first and talk about some of those pieces. So the anatomy of a workflow is that there are stages, steps, transition actions, and people that you add. There can be an unlimited number of stages. Most typically I see between 3 and 7 stages in most clients' workflows. Within a stage, there are specific steps, specific tasks that you are asking people to accomplish. You can have multiple steps within a single stage. Most typically you have one, but you can have multiples. The things that are happening in stage 2 here, stage next, cannot happen until stage 1 has been crisply exited through a transition action. Think of a brick wall between stages. And you can't get from one stage to another unless you use a transition action, which would be a submit, an approve, or reject. You saw some of those in my earlier example. Steps are more fluid. These two steps would be happening simultaneously. There's no particular order that they need to happen in. Step B might be completed before step A. It doesn't matter. If the order does matter, if step A must be completed before step B, if that must be the case, then you don't put them in the same stage. You would create its own stage, right? So it's consecutive and linear across stages. This last piece down here is flagging that you add people to each, you actually add people to each step within a stage. So this would have two groups of people, and this would have one group of people attached as the steps. There are 3 different ways. You choose one of 3 ways to associate people to a step. It's a critical thing too. There's a lot of flexibility in this, in how you add these, one of these 3, how each of these 3 things work. So that's a big focus of today's session. So the anatomy, stages, steps within a stage, transition actions move you across the stages through to the completion point. So there are for each of those pieces, there's little worksheets in the cookbook. This is the worksheet to complete a step, to start, create a stage. It's very simple, a name and a color. And then create a step is the most complicated part of the workflow. This is what the worksheet looks like. We're going to look at that in more detail in the demo. But it's a worksheet that you complete. All these pieces have to be, you have to have an answer for all these pieces. And then a transition action is also a piece that you create. That's a very simple little mini worksheet, and we'll look at that in detail as well. So kind of a worksheet for each of those 3 components, the stage, the step, and the transition action. I'll reverse a bit and comment that the people, those 3 different ways to associate people, happen at the step, and this is what that part looks like. We'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. This is just a repeat again of that anatomy. So let's talk a bit about those 3 ways that you can add people. All 3 are user group based. So if you're familiar with that's a fundamental part of the Data Cookbook is a user group. And you define a user group, you can set permissions for that user group, and then you add people to that user group. For starting an object, in order to get something started, to create a new definition, create a new specification, you need to be, you as a user, need to be in a user group that has minimal editor permissions for that object type. So you need to be an editor for definitions. You need to be an editor for specifications. Once that object is starting to traverse through the workflow, you get your permissions through the step itself. So it voids the permissions that are associated with a user group per se, and what is in operation is whether you were given the edit or the, I can't think what the other permission is, edit and something else, we'll get there. Permission, edit and collaborate, that's what it is. You're granted that at the step itself. Approval is also granted through the workflow. So if you are in the user group that is assigned to the last stage that is sending the object to that approved state, you have that approval permission, so to speak. How that differs, if you're familiar with the old default workflow where the data steward could approve it automatically, what we're seeing now, why we needed flexibility in that approval permissions and did no longer want to associate approval permissions with at the user group level, was because we were seeing folks want to add a stage of centralized standards review to their workflow after the data steward had done their thing. So the data steward often nowadays is not the final approver of the object. It's often a centralized standards review process that comes after the data steward. All right. So of the 3 ways to add people, simple user group, something called an assignment mapping, and something called a named role. Assignment mapping and named role are new in the customization features. Assignment mapping will automatically route an object based on one of these 4 attributes. Automatically routes by functional area, automatically routes by data system, etc. So it allows you to route automatically based on an attribute to a specific group of people. Named role, first of all, is not automatic. A person in user group A selects another person in user group B. So in this case, think of it as a manager. The manager's in the first group, and they will assign the work. Perhaps it's the work of building a report. Perhaps it's the work of writing a technical definition. They want to control and assign that work to a specific individual. They don't want it automatically routed by data system. So some graphics for those of you who are visually oriented. Here's the user group example. So let's say there's a single user group and it's called the standards expert. There's 3 people in it. So the 3 people are equal. They act equally in that group. And it uses, this is a picture from the Data Cookbook of the user group screen, so it just pulls from one of these user groups. The use case is when there is you have a small group with the same expertise. So any standards expert could do the job. It's also useful in highly collegial groups. People that sit physically next to each other. They can just verbally say, hey, I'll take that one, or hey, could you take that one? So when there's high collegiality and high accountability, a user group can work. They're often also used in governance groups. If you have a group of 9 members of your some kind of centralized data governance definition review, you can put them all in a single group and insert them as a group into a workflow. Assignment mapping, here's 3 examples, one by functional area, one by data system, and one by spec type. So you would have a user group here. This is by functional area, perhaps admissions, data steward by, or data steward for admissions, data steward for enrollment, oops, went too far, data steward for human resources, or by data system, technical editors for my ERP, technical editors for my data warehouse. So there would be a user group. You need a user group for each of these segments. You can also use spec type, dashboards, basic report, data block, as a way to assign an object to a specific, route an object to a specific group of people. Use cases are when the task is the same probably, right? You want some technical editing here, you want some data steward action here, but you just want to isolate a certain segment of that, and you don't want the noise. You don't want everybody to be seeing all that other traffic. It's not about me, I don't want to see it. So this allows you to reduce the noise and target that. So same task is happening, but lets you target it to a subset. That's the beauty of it. Here's what it looks like in the cookbook. It's a worksheet, and you have here, this is illustrating a functional area. Here you have your functional areas listed on the left, and the mapped user group is on the right. So each of these user groups had to be built, had to be created. Assignment mappings tend to spawn a lot of user groups. Named role. Person A selects a person from person B. Usually there's a backup person in group A. And then group B is usually peers, and for whatever reason, workload balancing, maybe it's expertise, this manager wants to select a specific person to accomplish a task. So it's highly personal, and lets you manage workload. And here's the worksheet for creating add named role. You identify the user group that's going to be selected from, so this is group B, and then you're going to name a user group that the manager is going to be in, group A. So you can see there's user groups are building blocks to both named roles and assignment mapping. All right, there's the anatomy repeat again. Here's a screenshot of what notifications look like. So if you are playing a role in the workflow, this is an example of what the text looks like. Sometimes folks want to see what people who are participating in the workflow, what that email is going to look like. You'll get a screenshot, probably a more readable screenshot of this when you get the recording tomorrow. All right, so now let's actually build a demo workflow. So the steps here are, your first thought is to sketch it out, draw it out, think about it before you put pen to paper before you go build it. And then we're going to build it, then we do what's called activate it. Then we pay attention to the order of workflows, how they appear, because they are executed in the order in which they are listed on the workflow page. You're going to test it, and then you're going to revise it. So that's the order when you're thinking of customizing your own or building your own from scratch. This is the order of, at a high level, of the steps you will take. So my sketch, I'm going to build a definition workflow today for you that has 4 stages and ends in the approved state. So there are a drafting stage, a data steward review, a technical editor review, standards review, and then the final approval state. So this illustrates, the data stewards doing their approval way up here, then it goes to a technical editor, then it goes to standards. All right, so let's go over there. So in the Data Cookbook itself, I'm going to travel over here to the organization page, and I'm going to select workflows. And this is where all of my workflows live, this drop-down box, and I'm in a knowledge account, so I don't see all of those, the full list that you see in an enterprise account. So I can scroll among my workflows here, but I'm focused on definition, and so I'm going to create a new workflow. And I'm going to name it definition approval with technical editing, and you can see I've already been practicing, so it prompts me for that text. And I have descriptive text already written. For those of you who have worked with me before, you know I am a stickler for the definition, for the descriptive opportunities in the Data Cookbook. That language appears in a mouse over in your actual definitions. Very helpful to somebody who wants to know what's going on with that workflow and they don't want to have to visit the main workflow area, over here. So it's a definition approval is our workflow type, and we're going to call it the drafting stage. It's very common for people to call the first stage drafting. And we're off. We've created one now. Here's my descriptive text, and there's a diagram. This is the drafting stage I just created. These come automatically. IData gives you only 2 end states. You're approved or you're rejected. I'm sure I'll get some questions about, tell me more about rejection. There's a lot of questions around how that works, and we can talk about that in the discussion period. So this is my central panel for this particular workflow. Next, I'm going to add my stages. So my next stage is, what did I say, data steward review, and I will choose a color and click create. There's my circle. I'm going to create my next stage, technical definition. I'll call it review. I select my color. I'll just go pink here just for high contrast. There's my circle. And then I had a standards review. And we'll make that one. I tend to stay away from the green and the red because it looks too much like the two end states. There, we'll just go pale yellow. There we go. Probably could use a little better contrast there, but so there's my 3 stages. Now I go back and what's my sketch? What am I doing here? So data steward review. So at the drafting, my next step is to build out what's happening in each of these stages. I'm going to start with drafting. I'm going to go over here and click show. And that's going to take me to another worksheet page that illustrates everything that's happening in this stage. Here's my steps. Here's my available transition actions. I can approve or reject. And those came automatically when I created a workflow from scratch. So the first thing I want to do is change this approve transition action. I don't want this person to approve. I want this person to submit to data steward. And instead of going to the approved state, I want it to go to the data steward review. It is the happy path. The happy path is the path that the object will take from point of creation to the approved state in the optimal path, the happy path. We're going to talk about entry point and override later on. Those are advanced details. So I'm going to update. So there I have submit to data steward as my new transition action. And if I look at my circle, you can see that that green happy path arrow is now going to data steward review. It is no longer going to the approved state. I changed it. That's what controls your transition action, is what controls those arrows. All right, so now let's get happy path from blue to purple. So I'm going to show data steward review. And I personally like to build my transition actions first. So the data steward, when they are completing this stage and heading to the next, I could either say data steward approved, or I can say submit for technical editing. And I'm going to say submit for technical review. And from there, it's going to go to the technical review stage. It is the happy path, and I'm going to click add. I also want to offer this data steward the ability to reject. And from there, it goes to the rejected state. And I also want to offer them the opportunity to return it back to the drafter. So I'm going to give them the ability to send it back to drafting. And it goes to the drafting state. So no, it's not the happy path. It's not necessarily a sad path, it's just not, it's an alternate path. So there are my 3 transition actions: red, alert, because I haven't consumed them yet, in a step. Now I'm going to pause here and slow down for just a second and talk about what I want to happen in this data steward review. Is I want an assignment mapping here. I want those definitions based on the functional area. I want them to go to the data steward for that functional area. So I want to use the assignment mapping for data stewards by functional area. So when I go to add a step, that's what the step name is called, steward This descriptive area serves as instructions to the actor in this step. So if you're smart, you'll write that in a way that tells them exactly what they're supposed to do. It cuts down on your documentation. It is required. I'm going to leave this any all. We'll come back to both of those in a minute. Here's where permissions come in. I'm going to let this person edit, and I'm going to allow them to bring in a collaborator. I do not want to give them a timeout. Timeouts are set in increments of days, and they only move forward in a happy state. So if I put a 3 here, it would time out in 3 days and would successfully move on to the next stage along the happy path. Here's my stage transitions. They appear here because I built them down here. So now I'm going to click them. I do want all of them. And here are the 3 places. I choose one where I can associate people to this. And as we talked earlier, I want to use an assignment mapping called Data Stewards by Functional Area. Okay. Let's come back up here and talk about required and any all. You can picture it. There's going to be situations where a definition is going to be assigned to 2 functional areas. If I want somebody from each functional area, and I do, to approve that definition, I click required so that the definition will wait until someone from each functional area user group will act. So I want it required. I want that object to wait until everybody who is allowed to act on it has acted. Any all, so this controls at the functional area level. Any all controls for the number of individuals assigned to a specific functional area. If I've got 3 people in the financial aid functional area, I don't need all 3 of them to act. I just need one of them, so I'm going to click any. Any of the 3 in financial aid can act. Okay, so now I'm going to click Save. And there's my assignment mapping with data stewards associated. Okay. And I'm going to show you the picture. And you can see we've started to build. There's our happy path there. In the interest of time, I am going to suggest that we stop there. Let me say a few more things about how to what happened next, though. If I wanted to actually use this workflow, I would need to activate it. And then on the listing of definitions, this is my definition workflow page. I have 3 now. So this would be activated, and I would put it at the top level of all of these workflows, because the one on top is the first one that the definition will look for. If the criteria is not met, it'll go to the second one. So this top one actually has a conditional on it. So if the functional area is human resources and human resources only, this will be activated. If not, it'll continue down. So I would want mine to be above this general definition approval one, but below HR approval. So the order of how they appear on this page is critical for how they are engaged when the definition is actually created over here. Okay, let me pop back over to see if there's anything. I think we talked, let's talk about override and entry point in those transition actions. The entry point is seen at the beginning of creating a definition. It appears down here at the bottom of the page. So this one has the data manager, the data steward can approve from this page, assuming that they created it, they're the data steward, why route it to themselves? It's a convenience. Just let me approve from the creation page, the entry point. So if you want that transition available at the very beginning, at the entry point, you click that box there in the stage transition actions. Override is not a button per se, it's a setting, and that allows an administrator to progress any definition, in this case, any object in that workflow to the next stage in the happy path. It's a way to unstick something, just as a courtesy to the admin. And then, so I'll stop there. Let's Let's go, okay. Some tips. You want to draw it and then quickly build it so that you can see it. I like to build in this order, stages first, and then I pay attention to my groups, my assignment mappings, my named roles, then I build my transition actions, then my steps. The steps consume 3 and 2, so I like to have those ready and built for me. Use simple concrete labels in your stage names and your step names. Show it to people, build it, then show it to people and expect to revise. I don't like to sit and wordsmith it at this. I don't like to sit and wordsmith it at the worksheet level. You know, when you're in the you know, in that panel where you're designing your stages and steps. I think you can see it better once you've actually designed it and you're looking at it over in the definition or the specification side. I think wordsmithing here is a tricky business. And don't be afraid to version your workflow. If it doesn't work out, just don't be afraid to version it, fix it, version it, and move on. If you do get stuck, need more help, even just once to have a conversation before you start, don't hesitate, reach out, support, and you can ask for me, you can ask for Aaron, you can just say you need some help. There's also the admin guide and the user guide have detailed information repeating what I said today. You can also post things in the forum. I think if you're looking for ideas for how to approach, you know, kind of at the stage level, how to structure, it's more of a governance question, how to structure your stages. To me, that's a good forum question. If you can't figure out how a certain feature works, that's a support question.